Order! Order in the court! Could everyone please settle down as we continue the appeal case for Dixie Shanahan versus the state of Iowa. After a long trial, it is now time for the defense to give its closing remarks. Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is to my dismay today that I must share with you the heartbreaking story of abuse that was Dixie Shanahan's life. After a traumatic series of beatings, Dixie snapped, killing her abusive husband. I'm not here to say or deny that Dixie did the crime, but the 50-year sentence she received is an outrage and an injustice. What kind of sentence is this for someone who received 15 years of consecutive abuse, both emotionally, physically, and mentally? She was in her own kind of prison for 15 years, escaped only to receive another 15. Unfortunately, this could have all been avoided through the acceptance of battered women's defense in Iowa. This defense would allow victims of domestic abuse to receive lesser sentences to sooner start their life away from abuse. In hoping to gain your support today of this defense and reducing Dixie's sentence, I will be going over the Dixie Shanahan case, what battered women's syndrome and defense really is, and what this would mean for if Iowa were to adopt this defense. All her life, Dixie Shanahan was subjected to abuse. As a little girl, she was first subjected to sexual abuse by her stepfather. When she was finally old enough to move out, she went into the hands of another man named Scott Shanahan, who would then abuse her for another 15 years. According to the Sioux City Journal, during her testimony, Dixie recounted the abuse she faced at the hand of her husband. He would push her downstairs, shove her head into toilets, and break plates over her head if he was displeased with her cooking. He ran her legs over with a riding lawnmower and would tie her up and throw her into the basement for 2 days at a time without food. The police had been involved, and Scott had been arrested 3 times, only to be released shortly after. One of the times he was arrested, was after Dixie was beaten bloody with a metal pole and had called the police, fearing that she would miscarriage the second child she was pregnant with if the beatings continued. Scott was arrested, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for domestic abuse, but he was released after just 4 days and paying a $1,000 fine. Dixie would then continue to receive regular beatings 3 to 4 times a week. However, the beatings would end August 30th, 2002. After finding out that Dixie was pregnant for the 3rd time with his child, Scott became outraged and began ruthlessly beating Dixie. As she tried to flee their home in Defiance, Iowa, he ran out, pulled her back into the home by her hair. He then loaded a shotgun, pointed at her face, and screamed, "Before this day is over, I'll kill you." He then set it down to continue beating her. After pulling all the phone wires out so she couldn't call for help, Scott went into the back room to rest. Once she thought he was asleep, Dixie picked up the shotgun, went into the room, and shot Scott in the back of the head. She then put a sheet over the body and closed the door to the back room, where it would remain closed for the next 14 months until Dixie was arrested. There's no doubt that Dixie killed her husband, but because she was not in immediate danger at the time, she was not able to claim self-defense, and she was not able to plead insane. She was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison without parole after 35. Now, many of you may be wondering, why didn't she just leave Scott? She didn't have to kill him. While this is very true, Dixie was not in the mental state at the time to comprehend this, due to a severe mental disorder known as battered women's syndrome. Battered women's syndrome is found by the Joyful Heart Association and recognized by many other domestic abuse organizations to cause depression, disassociation, and PTSD. It causes a learned helplessness where a paralysis overcomes the victim. The victim becomes so defeated, depressed, and passive that they believe that they are incapable of leaving their abusive situation. They do not have the mental capacity to understand that they need to lead this kind of life. Dixie did not leave Scott because he was all she knew. He was the father of her children, and he had promised to change so many times. It's this hope that Dixie clung to that thousands of other victims of domestic abuse victims hold on to as well. If she had been granted battered women's defense, so if Dixie suffered from such a severe mental disorder, why wasn't she able to receive a lesser sentence? Well, according to the legal dictionary, self-defense is defined as the use of reasonable force to protect oneself or one's family member from the attack of an aggressor if the defender believes that they are in immediate danger. And the plea of insanity goes by the Manhattan rule, where at the time of committing the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defect of reason from disease of the mind that they were not able to understand the act they were committing. And if they did not understand that it was wrong. Because Dixie went into the back room when Scott was sleeping and shot him in the back of the head, she was not able to claim self-defense because she was not in immediate danger, even though she knew the beatings would continue. And while it can be accepted that she is not completely insane, it can be argued that her mental state at the time was definitely not normal because she was not able to determine right from wrong, for she clearly suffered from battered women syndrome. This picture was taken by the police after one of the times Scott was arrested. Her face is bruised, her eye is swollen shut, and she looks tired and defeated. After 15 years of treatment like this, would you be mentally stable? If battered women's defense was accepted in Iowa, Dixie would have claim to a defense that would be somewhere between self-defense and insanity. But the danger she would be considered in wouldn't be immediate, and battered women's syndrome would be considered the severe mental disorder it is. Finally, I would like to go over what this would look like in the state of if the state of Iowa were to adopt this defense. Even though 39 states have already accepted this defense into their law, Iowa still has not accepted it due to its rocky genuine exception in court. Opposing counsel and many believe that this will just be an excuse for women to kill their husbands. However, this is not the case. This does not allow abused women to go free for murdering their husbands, but it simply allows mitigating circumstance, which means the defendant qualifies for a lesser sentence, or is considered for a lesser sentence. Cornell University law provides the requirements for this, saying that the defense will need to call the witness and expert to determine whether the defendant indeed qualifies as a battered woman. For example, in the state of Connecticut versus Ashik Yosef, a case similar to that of Dixie Shanahan's, Yosef was allowed to claim battered women's defense since it is allowed in Connecticut. The state then argued that the testimony was essential for the juries to understand why the victim did not end her relationship with the abuser, why she did not report prior results, why she did not flee the scene of the assaults, and why she complied with the abuser's demands. Because the burden of proof, the defense was able to accept the burden of proof, Yosef was able to claim battered women's defense and receive a lesser sentence. Because battered women's defense is not yet accepted in Iowa, Dixie Shanahan was not so lucky. Finally, before the jury dismisses to come to a final verdict, I would like to review what was presented today. First, we went over the 15 years of abuse that Dixie Shanahan suffered, only to be sentenced to another 50 years in prison. Next, we went over the damage of abuse through battered women's syndrome. And finally, and most importantly, we went over what this defense would look like in Iowa and how it would help domestic abuse victims. Even though the Iowa judicial ignored the need for this defense, justice prevailed and Dixie Shanahan's sentence was reduced from 50 years to 35, qualifying for parole after 10. This was only after six jurors from the jury that had convicted her found her guilty, wrote to the judge asking to reduce her sentence. Letters came flooding in from California to UK to the Iowa State Court in her defense. This is a rare case that does not happen for all victims of domestic abuse. Please help these victims, the thousands of victims of domestic abuse, get back to regaining their lives that have been beaten down so many times. And please help support these women by implementing this defense into Iowa law. Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.